Welcome to the Intifada Globalists, a podcast against international Zionism. I'm Anonsus.
And I'm Doug.
On today's episode, what we're really focusing on is a particular conspiracy theory that has sort of circulated for a while now in discourse around Zionism and against Jewish power. So just for some context, as our listeners are aware at the moment, the Jeffrey Epstein case has obviously exploded in the popular conception, right? And so Jeffrey Epstein, a man who pled guilty to the sexual abuse of a 14-year-old, right, in a trial stemming from dozens of similar accusations, has been sort of recognized as a covert diplomatic agent of Israel, right? His partner, Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of a 20th century Israeli agent, Robert Maxwell, has also been convicted of sex trafficking. Now, obviously, Epstein's, he was convicted of stuff. He's dead now, so who knows how the second trial would have gone. But the point is that right now, there is a lot of discussion going around on the nature of Jewish identity politics globally and its connection to global elites. And unfortunately, we've seen this discussion become muddled with, dozens of conspiracy theories that are obscuring the explicitly Zionist and Jewish identity political nature of this, the Epstein-Maxwell affair. So our goal on this podcast is to kind of walk the tightrope to stay in the middle of two categories. We don't want to become, Michael Tracy on one end. We don't want to fall the other way and become Candace Owens. And so to discuss one of the conspiracy theories that we're seeing, we've got, really an expert on this topic to talk about the Khazar hypothesis. And that is our guest today, Need More Amalek. So I guess to start us off, I'll just call you Amalek, I think, going forward. To start us off, Amalek, what is, if you were to give a really brief summary for our listeners who maybe aren't aware, what is the Khazar theory?
Hey, thanks. So the Khazar theory, to just do a very brief description, is essentially, or the Khazar hypothesis is sometimes called, is basically the concept or the idea that the primary descent of Ashkenazi Jews is not the ancient Israelite populations of the Near East, but instead a medieval Turkic group called the Khazars, who converted to Judaism in the Khazar Empire long ago in the 900s, is basically around where these people think that this theory comes from, somewhere around there. That's what I would call traditional Khazar theory, but I have a broader definition of it that I think you'll like, where I include what I call left-wing Khazar theory, and this is basically the concept that the Jews of today, like Bibi Netanyahu, go back to Poland, you're European, he's a white guy, and this whole thing. Because these two ideas, these two concepts, traditional Khazar theory and what I would call left-wing Khazar theory, these two ideas have the same genealogy and they come from the same place. It's just that we're looking at them now today and we think that they're two different things, but really it's the exact same idea that has just shifted throughout time on how it's been used and things like that. And we'll go through all of that. But basically, that is my working definition. Is essentially any time that somebody is saying, when we're talking about Jewish power or Jewish history, and their next retort is, well, actually, there aren't the real Jews, they're blank, or, oh, well, actually, they're white people and they're from Eastern Europe, and things like that. Any sort of argument that does that deflection, I consider under a broad definition of Khazar theory, basically.
Yes, and so I think this is really interesting because you've absolutely seen this stuff explode. And I am somebody who, because of how I got into politics, I was vaguely familiar of the Khazar theory stuff. I was never really somebody who knew anything about it. And it really is becoming a major part of the discourse right now. And like you've articulated, a lot of it is just kind of blame shifting away from the reality of the situation and sort of obscuring that. But I guess to start off, when you talk about Khazar theory, the general consensus, basically all I knew about it until, reading your research, was that allegedly speaking, in this sort of Khazar state in Central Asia, there was some kind of mass conversion to Judaism, right? Now that I say right, that turns out that's actually quite wrong. So where do you first see this Khazar theory or the Khazar hypothesis like take off? Where is there a kernel of truth there, or is it sort of entirely fabricated?
Yeah, that's actually kind of where some of the confusion comes from. So, what I would say is the best way to describe this is the very earliest layers of the Khazar theory. So, the best way to think of the Khazar theory, as I've defined it, is in layers of creation. Okay, and the very earliest layers of this creation are what we would call like a bunch of political letters and documentations about merchants and things like this. They're basically Islamic geographers that wrote in the 9th and 10th centuries who briefly mention these things. And they mention conversion of the elites or the nobles within the Khazar uh, Empire. The Khazarian Empire is what it's called. And then after that, we've got the Khazar correspondence and a couple of other small letters. But the real big first, outside those letters, the big first piece that we have is what's called the Kuzari, which is basically like a medieval polemical piece that was written in Spain. And the reason that they're using, Hazaria at the time, the reason that they're using that as the polemic or in the polemic in the story is that they're basically trying to tell a story of why Judaism is better than Islam and Christianity and paganism. And to tell that story, they're using a Khazarian Empire figure. It's sort of like a stand-in to say, like, in a land far, far away, because at the time, Ukraine, which is where Khazari would be, is so far from Spain. So they're using it as like a way that we would understand as saying, far, far away, in a land far, far away, in the land of Khazaria. And that's really kind of what's going on. Is they're basically taking like this kernel of truth to the idea that some nobles within the Khazar Empire converted, and they're writing literature on that. But I just want to just be clear, two things. First of all, this would have been a very small number of converts, these nobles. This would have been at most, you could estimate like 40,000 people. That's the first thing. The second thing is that these guys were not connecting it as the origins of Ashkenazi Jews or anything like that. The whole purpose of it, this whole like conversion story and all these things, it had nothing to do with like the Jews that we would know are at the same time developing in the Rhineland, in a parallel way, entirely separate from these Khazars, right? And what ends up happening is the Khazar Empire gets destroyed by the Kievan Rus state from one of their pagan warlords basically comes in and wipes them out. So it's not even a very long-lived state, okay? And so part of what Khazar theory entails is saying that the people that we're dealing with when we say Jews, so whether that's secular Jews or religious Jews or Zionist Jews or communist Jews or any of these things, that people are saying that those aren't really Jews. What they really are descendants from this shattered Khazarian empire who converted to Judaism in the 900s. So that's kind of where I would say it starts.
Is there a gap filler hypothesis for? So you've got Hazar Khaganate falling in 965 ish. Then, really quickly, I mean, even before then, but if we're being really generous, then we could say 40 years afterward, we have this Rhineland sort of proto-Ashkenazi Jewish community, which doesn't seem to share a whole lot in common with the Hazar Khaganate. So what is the explanation, or is there an explanation for how this transition from the east of Europe to the west of Europe took place so quickly?
Well, I would think that I would say this. I would say that they're totally separate. In that, I think that the Rhineland people were likely there a little bit earlier than we have records for. That's the first thing. But the big thing is, and how I would describe this is that if I was living in like the 1800s and I had limited research, I could totally buy into the premise of the Khazar theory as an explanation for Ashkenazi Jews. I detail that in my research. I go through basically how interesting it is how this idea went through nationalist movements and Zionist movements as well, and anti-Zionist movements, for various reasons. So I could totally understand why people would think that. But what really crushes the arguments in the end of the day, the big knockout punch, which we should just, I guess, kind of maybe say this now before we get into all the history, is that the genetic evidence that we have completely demolishes the theory. Like time and time again, they've done research and meta-analysis and all these other things to show that this isn't true, and the genetic data just destroys it. So that's what I would say is the first thing that would kind of go against your point. But the second thing, or what you're saying with the Rhineland, but the second big thing is linguistically. Yiddish is not a Central Turkic dialect at all, and there's no cultural artifacts that appear in Ashkenazi Judaism as like a cultural artifact or anything like that. So those things would appear if there was some evidence of this. And then like the third thing I would say that you would see if this was true, like right, if when the Khazarian Empire is destroyed, boom, all those Jewish nobles like head to the west, maybe they integrate with the Ashkenazi, right? If that's like this is the best case scenario. The problem is that we have no records at all of a migration like that, and essentially they'd have to go through many countries that we do have written records from that time, including Kiev and Rus, right? Poland had the courts of Poland would have wrote about this. We have their records. The Holy Roman Empire would have written. I mean, they would have had to go through essentially like a dozen or 24 different realms, basically, and we have no records of any sort of migration. And it would have had to have been, like I said, 40,000, 50,000 nobles are what converted. But if we were to just take grant them the argument, the Khazar theorists, and let's just say it was a full conversion of all the people of the Khazaria, so 500,000 to 1.5 million, somewhere around there. Let's just say it was all of them. If that's true, then we would obviously have records of a migration of up to 1.5 million or whatever people traveling from basically modern day Ukraine to the Rhineland, right? And we have none of those things. So I would say that's the kind of the best way to steelman, like, okay, well, they were destroyed, where'd they go thing. So yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, granting them enough contribution to later Ashkenazi populations for the theory to work would require the provision of more historical evidence, more material evidence, and you also point out that we don't see a progression of like Turkish and progressively less Turkish as it goes westward material culture, which would line up with some great Khazar migration to the Rhineland.
I guess kind of the next thing to go from there then, right, is if, because we know that this didn't happen, as you've pointed out, because there's no evidence of migration, because there's no genetic evidence, right? The question has to become, how does this idea, which starts as a Jewish polemical piece written in Spain, become sort of a dominant theory, at least, or I wouldn't say necessarily dominant theory, but a major theory in discourse around the Ashkenazi Jews, right? And something I read from your research that's really, really interesting is you go from this sort of writing in Spain, right? And then it's kind of, for a time, really not something anybody's discussing, right? This was not like some idea that immediately took off in the medieval world and became this like powerful theory to justify the Khazarians. In fact, it really seems to have a resurgence. Not, it starts out in the 1200s and has a resurgence kind of in the 18th century. So what's kind of the process that brings the Khazar theory out of a Jewish polemical piece and into European academic discourse?
Yeah, so basically the story there is, like you said, so it basically lies dormant for a very long time, basically until the 1800s, from the 12th century all the way to the 1800s, or 17, 1800s. We have no basically nobody talking about Khazars or Khazars. To what extent there is communication to talk about Khazars, they in no relationship have anything to do with Judaism. A lot of talk from the Byzantines about Khazar mercenaries this and Khazar merchants that. It was like a kind of a catch-all term for Central Asian, basically. And just to mention also, just so everyone knows, like if you didn't, like if this Khazar theory was true, it would mean that genetically speaking, Ashkenazi Jews are essentially Central Asian, closely related to like Uzbekistan people, Uzbekis, essentially. Just so everyone knows. And if you just Google what an Uzbeki looks like, I think like this is the type of stuff where it kind of shows that people who believe this have done no research, right, or aren't good researchers. I'll grant them. So that's kind of what I would say about that. But as far as how it transitioned and kind of woke back up, I guess you could say, is it wakes up in the Russian Empire in the late 18th century. And a lot of people will cite this one guy. They'll say, "Oh, Isaac." They'll say a rabbi in the 1800s. I hear, which is somebody repeating like a bad meme. That's not who they're talking about. They're talking about a different guy. His name is Isaac Bear Levinson, and he's basically the first kind of person that's talking about Khazar, but it's totally not in this context. It's basically him trying to argue. This guy is a Jewish Enlightenment thinker, okay? And what he's trying to say is he's trying to say that Judaism had converts. Look, the Khazars converted. And he's pointing to the Khazari, and he's saying, look, the Khazars converted. Therefore, Judaism is not an ethnic religion, but instead a universal religion like Christianity, and therefore we should not be subject to anti-Semitic laws, is essentially what he's arguing. Okay, so this is basically not really Khazar theory, right? Like, but this is a Jewish guy who's using the story of the conversion to avoid anti-Semitism laws. So that's the first kind of resurgence. But the big resurgence, I would say, is also in Russia again, and this is with the Karaites. Okay, the Crimean Karaites is what some people will know them as. And if you know anything about the Karaites, basically what those are is it's a type of Jew who does not follow the Talmud and only follows the Torah or the Hebrew Bible. Okay, and it's like a specific Jewish sect, and essentially what they were doing is same thing. Russia had basically Russia when the partition of Poland happened, Russia just gained a ton of Russia gained a ton of Jewish population. And at the same time, this is ideas like nationalism and romanticism are like blending throughout Europe, okay? And they're kind of trying to answer the Jewish question. This is when the Jewish question starts getting talked about. And the Karaites are kind of like this way of answering that. And in their own way, they say, hey, we shouldn't be subject to anti-Semitism or laws against rabbinic Judaism because we're actually Jews who don't follow the Talmud and just the Bible. And in fact, we didn't even convert until the Khazars did, because that's who we are. We're the descendants of the Khazars. And what's interesting is that geographically this sect was from the same place. So it was you can see how this argument basically worked. And what's crazy about this whole thing is this worked. The Russian Empire granted this to them. And these Jews, this sect of Jews, was allowed to operate outside of all the laws that traditional Jews had to, be under during the 19th century in Russia. Okay, so this is the first time, or maybe one of the first times you could say, where it's like used for a political purpose, right? So now it's political. So before it was just a polemic and a peace, before it was just scant evidence of, some people converting in the empire that was crushed, but now we have it entering basically like, okay, how do we take this, what I would call historical fiction genre, and how do we weaponize that myth? How do we turn this historical fiction genre into a weapon, basically? And this is something that I think is very important for everybody to understand, that Khazar theory and debunking it, it's not just like something that we go through, we debunk, and we're done with it. What this is it's a blueprint, and we'll go through it more, but it's like a blueprint on how they use what I would call the historical fiction genre, which is like, this Khazari stuff, and they use it for political means or political ends, okay? And this whole story is a perfect example of that.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just saying, the thing with the Karaite example in particular, that also strikes me as like, again, early 19th century Russians not knowing as much as we do now about history, because the history of the Karaim is going the other direction. The reason why in
Yep.
this Turkic-speaking Crimea, which is annexed by the Russian Empire, the reason why they're there is because the place they had previously lived, the Mediterranean areas, especially Egypt, if we're going far enough back to where they allegedly emerged from the Khazars, like those areas were also conquered by the Ottoman Empire. So they were heading from south to north within the Ottoman Empire. It's not like they just emerged into existence in Ukraine. Karaim, I mean.
It's really interesting, actually. This is maybe not quite related, but maybe an analogy I can use for some listeners. If you're familiar at all with the medieval story of Prester John, right, of this sort of mythical
Perfect
Christian
example.
king
Yep.
in the Far East, that at various points, medieval theories would go, oh, well, maybe the Mongols are Prester John. There was this belief, basically, that somewhere, in the distant East, there was this Christian kingdom that would help us fight back against these Muslim incursions, this really powerful Christian kingdom. And what ended up happening is, for the longest time, they couldn't find this. And eventually they find Ethiopia, which, if you know anything about the history of Ethiopia, is sort of this long-standing Christian kingdom. And so people started going, wait a minute, and this is more in like the 1600s, Ethiopia must be the Prester John that people were referring to. This is, almost certainly not the case, but it's people taking this kind of old myth or this old story and then applying it to their current circumstances to explain something that they otherwise didn't grasp, right? Like, otherwise, this story or this idea that, the entire time the Ottomans have had to their south this Christian empire, you go, oh, well, that must be what we were thinking of when we were talking about Prester John. And it really strikes me that, you're seeing essentially these Karaite, is that correct? Karaite Jews use this sort of Khazarian Jewish hypothesis to like justify why their state is as it is, and as you pointed out, to get around sort of Russian anti-Semitic laws. Because an important thing to remember when you're talking about the Russian Empire is that the Russian Empire, was led by a sort of Orthodox Christian ethnic Russian, and really German too, if you talk about the nobility, like ruling class. But Russia at the time included a lot of peoples. It still does. There were Muslims, you had, essentially Asians, you had Poles, you had Ukrainians, Belarusians, you had a massive, the Baltics group of people that followed, Catholicism, Judaism, Islam, all kinds of different sects and faiths. And the way the Russians would govern is, they had different rules for these different groups. And so I thought it was really interesting that these sort of Crimean Jews essentially were able to kind of use this old story to get, kind of legal exemptions, right?
Well, hold on. This is what was going out throughout all of Europe, right? Like, think about this, just as an example, and I can actually go into this using this, is like the Hungarians at the time. The Hungarians are basically a group of people ruled by the Habsburg Empire, right? Which is like got a whole history to it we don't have to get into. And this empire is ruling over many nations, many ethnic groups, and they all are in this like romantic period where they're all writing about their mythical past or their legendary past that are from their people's like folklores, and they're all scrubbing through old texts and looking for the most obscure versions. It's basically like, how the internet is, and there's like an explosion of conspiracy theories. It was like the version of that back then was going on, essentially, in relation to what I would call, ethnic or racial or European or nationalistic identity, just that whole concept of nationalism. Okay. And so all of Europe was doing this. It wasn't just the Jews. Okay. So the best way to really understand this is just the Jewish version of that process. And as we can see, it's like to get away from legal things. And I just want to go back to one thing real quick that you said. The Prester John example is a perfect example, another perfect example of this like myth to power or like mythical way of looking at political power. And the Prester John example is just like Khazar theory that was reused for political purposes multiple times, all the way up to the Taiping Rebellion. I don't know if you know what the Taiping Rebellion was. Essentially, it was a guy in China
Jesus'
claiming.
brother.
Yeah, claiming to be the brother of Jesus, and European powers started saying, "Oh, that's Prester John." Okay, so this was reused all the way up to basically the 1800s and the Victorian times. Okay, so and it's still used today for other things, but Khazar theory is very exactly similar to what you're talking about, where it was basically like used. It's like a mythical. It's like I said, it's using the historical fiction genre, mixing it with religious terms and terminology, or but let's just call it like identity language. So we broaden it to be not like secular. Anytime that you're mixing like identity language with this historical fiction genre for political means, right? And we can see how Jews do that with these stories.
Yeah, and this myth to power concept, we see it. Sorry to get out of chronological order, but in Kessler's case, he is actually doing something similar to what the Karaim are doing. Although in his case, it's fighting against like biological racialist anti-Semitism and presenting an account of history in which that would be unreasonable in an era before genetics, of course. But could you go into that sort of second use, unless Nazis has a point to make in between?
Real quick, just for the sake of our listeners might be aware of a different Kessler. So if you could quickly describe the Kessler we're talking about.
Yeah. So, well, here, let's just fast forward a little bit because a lot of the stuff in the middle.
So, how much do you know about tiki torches?
Well, so basically, what I would say is the rest of the history, it kind of intersects with Zionism in a little way. Like the earliest Zionist movement was flirting with it, and then essentially we don't get a whole lot of Khazar theory going around during, and it doesn't pop up again until World War II. And World War II, it pops up because the Nazis, NSDAP, explicitly railed against it. So they absolutely did not believe in it. We have, I mean, so many internal documents and writings and things about the, official policy papers from for the party and letters where they're talking about this concept, and they themselves call it bullshit, right? So that's kind of where it goes from there. And then after World War II, the theory kind of again lays dormant for a little bit. There's a couple of people that bring it up. But the real big next kind of, and I would say like probably the most influential piece is Arthur Koestler's book. And Arthur Koestler is a Hungarian Jew in 1976 who writes this book called The 13th Tribe. Okay. And what this book is doing is it's taking the Kuzari, which I mentioned before, and lots of those letters that I mentioned as well. And it's essentially constructing this Khazar hypothesis as we know it today, right? Where we take the idea that the Ashkenazi Jews, their origin comes from this Khazar conversion, and he really solidifies it in that book, okay? Now, what's important about him and what's important about understanding this is that, again, he's an Ashkenazi Jew, Hungarian, and the purpose, he says, of the book is this, and I'm quoting right now. It says, the main thesis of this book is that the bulk of world Jewry is of Khazar and not of Semitic origins. If this is so, then the term anti-Semitism becomes void of meaning. Once the myth of the chosen people and a racial continuity from the biblical Israelites is abandoned, the traditional basis of anti-Semitism collapses. So, in other words, the whole purpose of the book is to fight against anti-Semitism on the basis of this. Essentially, a lot of anti-Semitism that Jews get throughout history is understandably calling them deicidal Christ killers. So the concept of the idea here is that Arthur had is if he's able to separate the genetic lineage of the people from the Old Testament Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, right? Because these are the same group, and sever that genetic that connection and say, oh, actually, we are Jews who didn't convert until the 900s under the Khazarian Empire. We aren't related genetically to the ones who killed Christ. It enables them, right, to sever that lineage. And in his view, it would reduce anti-Semitism. So this is what I would say is the major, huge source material that takes this idea out of what I would call like obscure nationalistic references and historical records and mythical Jewish polemic pieces and things like that, and he takes it out of this like obscure nature and he makes this public facing book is the best way I would describe it. It's for the layperson. It's kind of for idiots is what I would say, and this is where it transforms into the way the state that we see it today is what I would say. So now we're talking about like actual Khazar theory in the layer that we would first like recognize something as Khazar theory is this book.
Yeah. So first of all, Arthur Kessler will decide and post how we wanted to pronounce his name. I was sort of Germanizing it, but anyway, he also worked at one point with a recurring character in our podcast, Mr. Jabotinsky. And
Yeah.
also, just a quick thing for what you were saying. I'm getting the impression from like Aaron Krieg on Twitter and other sources you mentioned that like a solid 25% of what the SS were doing was like batting away different boutique folklore about who are the real Jews, who are the fake ones, like British Israelism this time, and this time it's Khazar theory.
Yeah, this is what I try to explain to people, like what I'm doing and what Adam's doing, and like this like debunking. People don't understand. Like they think that, oh, you're just helping Jews by like destroying the reason that people are anti-Semitic. Like people are anti-Semitic. Who cares if they believe in Khazars? Who cares if they believe, we was the real Jews? All this other stuff. And what I'm trying to tell them is this is a tradition that goes back to, I mean, the earliest stages, I would say, or again, I'll use the term layers, the earliest layers of like the JQ, like Bruno Bauer. Okay, like if you don't know who that is and you're in this, like you're fucking up. Like I don't know. He completely understood it the way I'm explaining it. Okay, and that in the way that we have to basically level up our people and debunk these things, because what we need to do is we need to like go towards the truth. Like that's kind of what gives us the ability to talk about these things, and it's like kind of one of the only powerful tools we have is that we have the truth. Okay, so we have to like level our people up out of Khazar theory, out of British Israelism and all these things. So you're spot on, exactly. The NSDAP was in the labs constantly cooking up ways of dealing with this problem, is how I would say. Even so, just debunking it wasn't the only solution. Coming up with new ones that are useful and things like this were other things that they were doing. Now obviously they got sidetracked and things like that, but they absolutely understood this concept where people not understanding what a Jew is means that the anti-Semitism is kind of, or the counter-Semitism, however you want to phrase this, is completely useless. It's toothless, as Hitler says, right? Where the idea here is, if somebody can point to like Jews doing something, and you want to say like, oh look, that Jew is doing X, Y, and Z, and the next response is, oh actually that person's not Jewish, this completely removes the effectiveness of like all the things that have been built, all the arguments and all the research and all the sociology that we have behind, all the things come crumbling down when you do that. And like I said, yeah, so they absolutely saw it like this, that it's imperative to make sure people understand who they're dealing with. And I get in all these arguments with these like, what I would call like, we call them Christo-Nazis, but that's basically what they are. It's people trying to mix the NSDAP with Christianity in a way that's like not historically accurate, and they say, oh, the NSDAP would have disagreed with you. Well, Hitler himself, in his own speeches and the way he explained these things, he explained them in his very earliest understanding of them. Is talking about Abraham pimping out his wife in the stories and things like that, connecting the Jewish people to the Old Testament. And what this does, when you do this thing with Khazar theory as a broader understanding, when you decouple the Jewish identity today from the Bible, you completely remove basically any useful critiques of Judaism, because it is in reality based on the Bible and that continuous lineage, if that makes sense.
I see what you mean, Mr. Leader. The Bolshevik Party, it's run by a bunch of Turkish Satanists who have a strange predilection for beef jerky.
It is, I think it's interesting, right? You mentioned, and for listeners real quick, who maybe aren't as into the history of sort of the, we'll say, sort of the anti-Jewish right or whatever. British Israelite theory is this, again, another sort of debunked myth, and this claims that the Jews in the Bible are European, right? And that the Jews you see in Israel, in the Middle East, in Europe, they are either Khazars or they are Arabs that converted or something, right? That they are
Edomites.
they are
That's
not.
Edomites is the most popular one.
Oh,
Yes,
but
they are
that
Edomites.
actually does feature into the Jewish Zionist religious narrative. Edomites means
Yep.
something different there. Sorry, go ahead.
But
Yep.
again and again, right? You see this pattern, and so the reason that British Israelite theory is relevant is that for a long time, especially in, ironically not England but America, uh, there was a strong undercurrent, especially in white nationalist spaces, of like what was called Christian identity, which is a British Israelite denomination. And so a lot of British, even though today this is not really popular, a lot of these ideas are kind of lurking in the background, right? And I think I'll be charitable and say that a lot of these guys did not have access to or did not know about some of the information we know now. So I can't, I always try to be charitable with people in the past and their understandings of things. But it's like these are arguments that even if you don't know that you're reading them or seeing them, they are kind of in the shadows behind some people's belief system. And crucially, right, and I think we can maybe move into this a bit, right? Why it's, become a topic today, or in the very least, why it's something that we're talking about. These are arguments against Israel or against Jewish power that are founded in nothing, right? They're founded in debunked myths from the past. And so when you make these arguments, like you were saying, you don't have the truth on your side anymore. You're now arguing essentially about myths, right? And you can be debunked. Like they can counter this. They can prove that this is incorrect. And you're also making arguments that, again, to your point, I guess I'm sort of repeating what you said a little bit here, but you're making arguments that automatically absolve, like the state of Israel of some of its guilt. When you say, for example, Netanyahu's Polish, right? You're saying this isn't about the Jewish question anymore. This is about like white colonialism in the Middle East, which is, like you mentioned at the beginning, sort of a left-wing Khazar theory take. Or if you're on the right and you say, oh, we're dealing with, Khazars and they're doing weird rituals from Central Asia, like you're not accurately addressing the situation. And so it's not a productive conversation to have. Like you're just sort of engaging in myth making. But I guess to bring it back to our guests here and to get a little more back on topic. So today, especially on the internet, there is this big sort of resurgence in Khazar theory stuff, especially in what we used to call the alt-light, right? Which it's crazy to think now that I would consider someone like Candace Owens to be alt-light. But you know what I mean? Like people outside of the complete political mainstream that aren't, what we would consider really, really persecuted dissidents. And, they seem to have really revived some of this talk around the Khazar theory. So what kind of has been the outcome of that? Like what has that done to the discourse?
Yeah, okay, so there's a couple things that you touched on here. So the first thing I want to touch on is the prison aspect. This is very important to understand. You said that it's not a very popular theory, British Israelism or Khazar theory in our circles, but like the best way I can say this to somebody who doesn't argue with these people all the time is I would say out of all anti-Zionists, both on the far left, far right, and normies, out of all anti-Zionists in the entire world, I'm using that term broadly because I don't want to just say all anti-Semites or something like that. I'm just saying anyone who's anti-Zionist. I would say that almost assuredly, we have no way of measuring this, but almost assuredly, I would say at least 50% of all anti-Zionists believe in some form of this. Right? You understand what I'm saying? Some form of, oh, they're not really Jews. It's not really Judaism. It's Khazars. Oh, they're white Europeans. Some version that fits within the definition. And probably somewhere around 50% or more of all anti-Zionists believe that. And the problem here is like you put out, is all of the argumentation issues. And I wanted to bring up the prison stuff. So this was pumped into white Aryan nations prison gangs, okay? So part of the reason that it's even in our sphere, okay, is because of that. is because it was pulled forward from those those vestiges when this movement, or white nationalism, however you want to describe this thing, when it was like living in the outcasts of society, prison gangs and things like that. Okay, and the government itself was promoting this, was literally paying for uh, British Israelism, but also outside groups that include Jews were paying for this. So that's why it's so popular in our sphere. That's the first thing I would say. And the second thing is, why is this becoming so popular, and how did this come to be, and how does that relate to the alt-right? Well, I'll basically explain it this way. I've already told you about the history of how it kind of developed in Russia, specifically, the whole Russian Empire has this it's kind of like one of their answers to the JQ is a good way to describe it, and how it kind of develops in Eastern Europe, right, in Hungary and other places for their own reasons. But where it really kind of, what I would say, pops off is during the Cold War, where the Soviet Union starts using it as a way, basically for a number of reasons, start using it as a way, promoting it in their scholarship, saying that Khazar theory is authentic, it's an authentic hypothesis, and all this other stuff. The Soviet Union is just pumping full, basically pseudoscientific research, promoting Khazar theory, and their aim was twofold. First of all, in Eastern Europe, if you tell the nationalistic or neo-Nazi movements of those times that were behind that wall, which are all like illegal gangs, by the way, all these illegal gangs, well, if they think it's Khazars, then they're not actually doing anything about Jews, right? We've already gone over that. Obviously, that kind of neutralizes them, is kind of the view there. But what they really did, and the reason that we really see it, is because they exported it to their communist movements, right, and their anti-Zionist movements, specifically Arab nationalists, okay? And this is why so many Muslims today believe this shit, okay? Right here, this is the moment. The Soviet Union basically pushed this outside, they did pseudoscientific scholarship and then promoted it to Arab nationalists as a way of basically fighting against Zionism, right? But think about what this is. We already understand this isn't actually good fight against Zionism. So it's almost like Russia was helping Zionism by doing this. You understand what I mean? So the USSR, the Soviet Union, they're promoting Khazar theory in mass all across the world at this time during the Cold War. Okay, this is very important to understand. This is the genealogy that shows why Go Back to Poland is actually the same thing as you're not Jews, you're Khazars. You understand? The same idea spread at the same time from the USSR, from about the 60s and 70s and 80s, around this time. This is when this is happening. And one of the ways the idea goes is George Lincoln Rockwell citing it, and various other white ethno-nationalists citing it. And another way it goes is through the communists and anti-Zionist leftists. Okay, and this is how we see those two ideas and how they develop today. So the left doesn't, they no longer do, oh, it's Khazars, because that's been debunked. So what they do is they say you're from Poland, okay, because that's just the way the left operates with this stuff. The right is still so far behind; it's still doing the Khazar thing with their cope version of this. But that's really a good way to understand it. And just to loop this all back into why it's so important today is, in my view anyway, is Candace Owens and the alt-right at large are all getting their information from what I would say is downstream, slop conspiracy things that have been on the internet since we were kids. I mean, 4chan had this stuff on it, just real bullshit conspiracies. A lot of them come from old Russian internet forums from the 90s and the early 2000s. A lot of the craziest conspiracies, but that's what's going on, is that a lot of these alt-right people, when COVID happened, okay, and when 10/7 happened, they woke up to the JQ, I guess you could say, basically being locked in their houses and then having 10/7 happen on their screens has now woken them all up to the Jewish conspiracy of the world, or however you would describe this. And what's happening is they're getting this information essentially from these like very low quality propagandist sources disinformation sources, however you want to describe these. And like that's where they're getting the basis for their anti-Semitism. And this is so important. And I'll turn it back to you. This is what people in our thing have to understand that have been around and doing this for a long time. We are misidentifying the chessboard. We are seeing that these guys, like the Candace Owens and the Tucker Carlsons, that they're like, oh, look, they're getting the word out. They're getting the word out. They're spreading the word. But we're not understanding that those people that are learning this stuff, that are learning about Jews or Jewish power, they all think it's Khazars, guys. They all think it's European Polish people, things like this, okay? So we have to address that problem, and we can't ignore it for very long. I think that this concept of upgrading people and like teaching them on how this stuff actually works, I think this is like the project of 2026, at least for me. So but that's what I would say about all that.
Yeah, this point you bring up about Soviet Zionology, I think, is an important missing link to understand. So within, anti-Zionist committee of the Soviet public, or within Soviet academia even, like Mahmoud Abbas and a few others went to university in the Soviet Union, you get this idea, or this series of ideas, that Zionism is like, it's sort of reversing cause and effect of who's doing what in regards to like the U.S.-Israel relationship, or the relationship of like the British Empire to Zionism. And you also get this related idea where like the Zionists are the real anti-Semites, that you get Havara Agreement stuff, or Mahmoud Abbas's work from when he was in college in the USSR, saying that like basically the Zionists are responsible for the Holocaust against the Jews as a way to like separate Jew and Zionist in a way that's really stuck around on bits of the radical left in the West.
Yes, and I think, if I could
Hold on, real
add
quick.
something.
Just real quick. Mahmoud Abbas, he believed in Khazar theory, and so did Maduro. So tons of old school leftists like that, or anti-Zionists, they all believe it. So a lot of times you can go to some of these far left, or these Soviet Union educated figures, and you could look up and just type in their name with Khazar for like direct quotes, and you'll find it. And he was a Khazar theorist as well. But go ahead.
Yeah, and so that's kind of what I was going to say, is that, right, you have this turn, and this is something I've been fascinated with, especially recently, right? You have the Soviet Union go from, aligned with Israel initially to anti-Israel, right? Yaki sort of traces this to the trials in Prague. But at some point you have this shift, right? And when that shift happens, what you have to realize with the Soviet Union is, yes, on some level, during World War II, the Soviet Union sort of developed a more nationalist, or at least less internationalist, like understanding of communism. But the Soviet Union was not an ethnic nationalist state. And so the Soviets can't just say, Israel's bad because it's Jewish power killing like Palestinians and going to war with its neighbors. They're not going to say that. You're never going to hear something like that out of the Soviets. And so it seems to me like the Khazar theory was sort of a way to push anti-Zionism that, and maybe I'm steel manning it, I don't know, that was not like quote unquote anti-Semitic, like you mentioned earlier. And the problem is, that's just not reality, right? That's not correct. And it's really interesting that this theory has remained relevant. We had a previous episode with a Palestinian, and he talked about sort of the Palestinian anti-Zionist movement, its history, kind of its evolution. And, it's notable, and maybe I'm getting into speculation here, I don't know. But sometimes you'll see people in the Middle East, pushing this Khazar theory stuff, or this idea that it's like white settler colonialism. And, they're never really making a super effective argument against Zionism. Because one, if Israel were like a white settler state, it's weird that would be the only one, and it's weird that all the white people doing it would be LARPing as biblical Jews. That seems like sort of a strange way to colonize places, and that's not something that Europeans really did at any other point in history. It's also like, it kind of defangs your argument a bit when you change from what is real and what is provable to something that can be easily debunked. Like, you never want to be making an argument that your opponent can debunk with 5 seconds of Googling, because at that point, and more importantly, I think, and you mentioned this right, when your theory of anti-Zionism or your opposition to Jewish power, when this is built on the foundation of they are the Khazars, what happens when you find out they aren't the Khazars, right? And that's where I think your idea of leveling up people, right, like educating people, I think this is so important, right? And it's part of the reason that we do this podcast is, it's easy to say, not always easy to say. If you're at a university, it's not easy to say. But it's easy to say on some level, right, I am anti-Israel. But you need to have actual justifications for this. You need to be able to point to examples. You need to be able to actually explain your worldview beyond just, saying because I learned to be that on the internet or because that's the based thing to do on Twitter, right? Like, you need to have an actual, like, solid ideological foundation that you can build on so that you're making, smart, coherent arguments that are hard to argue against. And the fear becomes, right, as you said, a lot of people at this moment are getting into the Jewish question. We've mentioned, like, October 7th and the Epstein case. I always talk about, that's sort of a 1-2 punch, right, where suddenly on a global stage, people have seen, a Jewish billionaire who was connected to Mossad, had all this power in the United States. With October 7th, you see how Israel conducts itself in war against Gentiles, and it's horrific, right? And now, even with Iran, right, you see that there's a war that's immensely unpopular with the American public, and the government will do it anyway. And there's almost a uniparty consensus, right? The only way to understand these issues is the root cause of Jewish power. That's the only way to understand these events, how these events connect, how things have happened like this, why, the American government would engage in such an unpopular action with, like, no regard for optics, seemingly, why Israel feels safe conducting, like, an open genocide, why Israeli politicians feel safe saying that they are, intentionally starving civilians, why, a guy like Jeffrey Epstein was able to operate for so long despite being so brazen in his conduct, right? The only way to really understand this is to have a correct worldview on the Jewish question. And you will never understand this if you think it's because a bunch of Khazars in the 1200s converted to Judaism. Like, that is never going to explain this. And if that is what you think, like, that is the root of your beliefs, then it's very easy for you to no longer think about the JQ, because your house is built on a foundation of, like, I don't know, like sticks, right?
Throne of lies.
Yes.
Yeah, and on that point, how it's like, if this is the only thing keeping you anti-Zionist, that's not a very stable anti-Zionism you have. So a lot of these people have adopted this Khazar theory thing in basically an otherwise Christian Zionist religio-political lens, however you want to term that. So basically, they are almost Mike Huckabee, but for Khazar theory. And the religion angle, I think, so on one of our previous episodes, we covered principally Christian Zionism, but got in a little bit to how their view of the end times has an interesting interplay with the religious Zionist Jewish view of the end times. And first of all, if you're trying to sever the Ashkenazi Jews within Israel from Jewish religious Zionism, you're not going to understand a whole lot of what they're doing, especially in the West Bank. So, like, our previous episode, the one right before this, is a reference to 1 Samuel, I believe, the Amalekites, from whom Need More Amalek also gets his name. And so, if you're basically agreeing with the worldview apart from a few modifications of the people you're allegedly opposing, but just sticking a little bit of, like, pseudo-genetic pseudoscience in there as a way to avoid becoming that, that's a really unstable foundation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's never going to work out if you can't even basically identify what Jews are here. Let's just set this aside. Everyone here is going to know this and understand this, but the population of Israel, okay, is a minority Ashkenazi, okay? So even if this was true, it doesn't explain Sephardics and Mizrahi Jews, okay? It doesn't. So this is not a holistic understanding, even if it was true. It is not a holistic understanding of the Jewish question. That's the first thing I'll say. The next thing is like, if you want quality people to be in this thing, you explain how, all someone has to do is Google it and they'll see. If we want quality people to be in this thing and to start trying to take on this problem as a serious problem, we have to basically like outgrow this peasant fixation with like allowing people to just believe noble lies because it's politically useful to us, if that makes sense. We basically need these people to believe better things if we're ever going to kind of advance the goals or move this forward to like the next step, the next phase. Okay, is how I would describe it. And you talk about how there's like this issue with kind of the presuppositions on if you accept Khazar theory, and you can see it perfectly um, with the left. Like for the left, they are found one of their foundational ideas is anti-Semitism. Okay, that is just part of who the left is. So what they're doing when they're engaging in Khazar theory, their version of it, by denying that they're actually Jews, is they're basically preventing that cognitive dissonance from happening. It's preventing them from having to deal with that issue, right? So it's preventing that far leftist or that leftist anti-Zionist from basically like moving to our side, moving closer to our side and seeing this as a problem with Jewish people and Judaism, right? So it's preventing that. But I have to point this out. Our people have this same issue, and you just kind of touched upon it, which is we have this idea in this circle that the religion of Jews doesn't actually matter, that the primary problem is genetics. And I accept this. I understand it. Identity, genetics, lineage, all these things are very, very important. I understand that. But if you just completely tune out and you don't study and analyze the religious angle, you're basically missing like the third leg to the stool. You're missing this part to understand the system of Jewish power. Okay. And then you can't really identify how that system works. Okay. So it's very important, I would say, for the right to understand this. And the part of the reason that we don't kind of analyze this stuff like this is because we have so many Christians from the right side, like the right wing. So a lot of, the left-wing version of, oh, we're against anti-Semitism, therefore we believe in Khazar theory. The right-wing version of that comes out with Christianity, where they're basically using Revelation 2:9, 3:9, John 8:4:4, and many other verses in the Bible. And they're using those verses as a theological way of doing the same thing, where they're able to say, "Oh, I'm not anti-Semitic," or or "I'm not anti-Semitic because they're not the real Jews; they're the Khazar Jews." And a lot of them are like bringing in this theology, I would say, that no church teaches. Essentially, no church is going around teaching, "Oh yeah, Rev 3:9 is Khazar theory." Okay, and within the context of those verses themselves, just take Rev 3:9 for example. This is a vision of Jesus talking to John of Patmos, telling him what he should write for in the Jewish messianic apocalyptic genre. Okay, this is not like Jesus in the Bible in the gospel. Or sorry, it is in the Bible, but it's not him in the Gospels in the Synoptic Gospels, like proclaiming this to the apostles or anything like that. This is a vision of Jesus after he was crucified, speaking to the prophet or to or John of Patmos rather. And these guys treat it like the
The
original
prophet kind of
intent
works.
of. Yeah, I guess so. They teach it. They treat this like it's the original intent of the verse when it's absolutely not. And if you just read, by the way, read it, it makes sense. So what I would say is, even though we all understand the problems with the left wing anti-Zionism, right? When they do the, oh, you're from Poland, or or BB's white, they're European colonialists. Everyone in our scene understands the problem there. But so many of our people, because they don't see the Jewish problem through the lens of religion as much, they totally miss this part where many, many, many of our guys are totally anti-Semitic because of things like Khazar theory, mixing in with those Bible verses, right? So this is why I got fascinated originally by it. Is this is a completely new theology. This is a theology that developed through like online conspiracy. It's kind of hard to trace exactly how this got started. There is like an anti-Semitic history, I would say, to Rev 3.9, but the way these guys are using it, where they're mixing Khazar theory with Rev 3.9 rather, this is a new thing, okay? And this thing is so prevalent in our circles, guys. If you just search Rev 3.9 on Twitter, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So yeah, that's what I would say about all that stuff.
Yeah, it's sort of I think in a way, distinctly Protestant, even though people who would call themselves, Tradcath, Orthobro, etc., read the Bible, where you basically, like, take a verse from over here, take a verse from this other book, and sort of mix them up into a whole new thing in a way that's ironically kind of like Jewish reading of the Torah.
Yeah, it's called Midrash. That's what it's called.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the earliest Christian tradition is Midrash. But go ahead.
Yeah, but you take, like, your father the devil from the Gospel of John, you take Revelation 3.9, you take certain parts of the crucifixion story in Matthew's, the one with blood be upon him, on your children, and you just sort of mix them together, not viewing them as like parts of separate texts, but as one single puzzle that God has laid out for you to put together.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate conspiracy theory, right? Like, oh, we're actually in the end. And what's crazy is, think about this. That means
there's even a secular version with Q drops. People do the same techniques.
Oh, I think it's the same. I think the Q thing is basically like a modern version of all the stuff I talk about. In 200 years from now, people are going to be saying, oh, was Q a historical guy or not? Oh, well, what do you mean? We have all these people writing about Q. You know what I mean? Like, it's ridiculous. Anyway, that's what Tacitus is. That's what Pliny is. That's what Josephus is, just so everybody knows. Anyway, so that is kind of exactly how I do view the whole, how Khazar theory plays out theologically, I guess you could say.
So I guess kind of what I'm thinking about as we discuss this, right, is strategy. We to kind of loop back a bit to the idea of leveling people up. And I think this is where, we can really do a lot of good. Like, if you have somebody who believes in, Khazar theory, if you have somebody who has this, or any of the variations of it, right? Like somebody who fundamentally thinks that, the Jews of today, the population that we would all agree is Jewish, the population that calls itself Jewish, are actually not Jewish. You have to educate them on this, and it's important that you do that. And I think this is where there's really a gap that we should be filling. Is if you have a guy, and other political movements do this, by the way. Like if you're a leftist and you don't understand communism, they will link you to books, they will link you to articles, they will try to get you to become a communist, right? But we have to realize that yes, a lot of people right now are getting into this topic. And that is a wonderful thing, that people are waking up, people are sort of becoming interested in this. And our job has to be to then say, listen, you are partially right. This is a major problem. All the evidence you've seen is true. But this isn't a problem because of, what a Spanish Jew wrote 900 years ago. This is not a matter of, all the debunked ideas that we've mentioned previously. And we have to kind of take it on ourselves and sort of get that burden, really, of saying, listen, we're glad that you're here. We're glad that you're reading this stuff. Yeah, it's awesome that you don't think I'm a crazy person anymore because you've seen the evidence of what I've been saying for years. Here's where you need to go to understand how I got to this point, even before October 7th, before the Epstein thing blew up, right? This is how I came to these conclusions. So that they can get kind of a correct worldview. And yeah, I think that now more than ever, we really need to be trying to, as much as we can, while there is sort of public attention on this, to kind of put the pedal to the metal and really, really educate people on this topic. Because we don't want this to become a fad. We don't want,
100%.
5 years from now for people to be like, yeah, there was this spike in anti-Zionism, but it faded away because all the people that believed it got into weird stories about the
Babylonian ball worshipping baby eaters. Yeah, that's pretty
yes,
much
there's
yeah.
there's
Yeah.
there's
You don't want people
political
to go from JQ one week to the lizard question the next week.
yes, and something that you written on like that I really liked is you talked about how like the flat Earth stuff for a lot of conspiracy theorists is a kryptonite because they believe in the flat Earth. The flat Earth is easily disproven, and it makes you if you hear a guy advocate for flat Earth theory, at least in my case, I go well. I automatically think less of the rest of this guy's opinions, right? Because he believes something that's easily disproven that is like total nonsense, and we have to kind of take a similar approach to the Khazar theory stuff, where if somebody is saying this, we need to convince them of the sort of the correct worldview, so that they're not going around saying something that our ideological enemies can easily sort of disprove.
That is just so true. That's exactly how I view it. Like basically, this needs to be relegated to the land of flat Earth within our movement, and it needs to be treated like, oh my God, that guy had Khazar, and everyone needs to be bullying these people and essentially like creating social systems around like combating this. And it's so incredibly important. And I didn't touch on this in the beginning. I probably should have, but part of the reason that I've been so into this is because I essentially had many of these ideas that like 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I guess now, where I believed in Khazar theory and a lot of this stuff that I debunk. I believed in this stuff. Now, I wasn't like a full like Khazar schizo conspiracy or anything like that. I was new to the JQ, and I just kind of like just kind of picked it up through osmosis or however you would describe that process. Oh, Khazar milker memes. Oh, Khazar milkers. That's so funny. Ben Shapiro's sister, Khazar milkers, right? Like this kind of thing. And so I get it. I get that that's how a lot of people got into this. So there's probably people listening to this being like, well, oh, that's how, I could never be in here without Khazar theory. I get that. I get all those arguments. And that's kind of why it's so important, I think, because I kind of saw that transition. And I imagine 10 years ago, me becoming JQ pilled. And instead of having to spend all this time researching and learning and updating, what if like just from the from the get-go, like I'd already understood like what Jews were. I didn't think that they were Khazars, right? So I do think that that's very important, is to basically combat believing it. And I say that as someone who used to believe it, right? So I understand why people might have that specific hang-up. But what I think is really kind of important here too is it kind of shows how the Jewish sandwich kind of grows, right? Essentially what's going on here is this is like, the Kuzari might be the moment the seed breaks from the plant, okay? And then the seed is planted with the 13th tribe in Arthur Koestler, okay? And now we see that plant grow, that Jewish sandwich plant, and we see how it grows into two different beasts, right? So my analogy is a little mixed up here, I guess, but really what I'm just trying to show is that, yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a good way to put it. What I'm trying to show here is that like this is how these like systems and these narratives kind of wrap around our people, because we don't identify the narratives and deconstruct the narratives and understand how these systems work. Okay, and we see how this stupid idea of a little, Spanish Jews writing stuff about magical land of Khazaria has now been politicized and weaponized in a way that we just the measure is never going to really be fully understood. We're never going to like simulate a world where this never existed, because who knows, we could have so like this problem could be solved quicker without this stuff, is what I would say. And then the other thing on this that's kind of important, especially in regards to like this showing that this is like part of this Jewish sandwich concept, is the people who promote the Khazar theory today that are outside of our sphere. These are basically Jews. They're like Zionist Jews. Paul Wexler, Aaron Elhawk, a lot of them are Jews. Okay. And these people are trying to promote this theory. And you asked earlier, like, how do we solve this problem? Like, how do we fix this problem? And in my view, two things. First of all, the Jewish side is absolutely just like they're pushing back and they're like engaging in this debate on their side to promote it. So somebody on our side has to. Somebody has to. Nobody can just like let them go and do their thing. So what I think we have to do, or part of what we have to do, is essentially, like I said earlier, become like educators. So for me, for this Khazar topic, I like, you guys kind of saw what I've wrote. I'm writing a complete comprehensive breakdown that's like, you know, pseudo academic or slightly academic, that traces the genealogy of all these ideas we've talked about today and kind of goes over some of the problems with them and goes into the genetic arguments and all these other things. And in that piece, I've got like a frequently asked question sections where I'm going to have all these memes that people see frequently and things like that. And really, that's kind of how I view this, like fighting against this, that we have to understand this is an educational problem and fix it that way. So I put together this whole piece so that people will be able to, in real time, like, oh, I have this resource I can pull up, and this guy posted that meme that everybody has. Oh, it's the Jewish encyclopedia meme. Oh, that's right here on the frequently asked questions because I see it 10 times a day. And oh, this is the debunk for that. And like that's kind of how we have to treat this, because on the left side, the way they're dealing with it and the way they're interacting with it, it's like you know, you've got all these academics and things like that, like these pseudo historians trying to justify it from their perspective. So we have to, because we have no institutional, like educational institutions, like, or, you know, we have no education institutions, we kind of have to take this upon ourselves to do. You know what I mean? Like we can't like wait around and wait for other people to educate on this topic.
Oh yeah, I just checked the FAQ section, and this might be a bit of a diversion, but so one guy we've sort of all had mixed feelings about. Carlson brought up this one point about you know, Israel banning DNA tests, which sounds like it's a little reference to this idea, but I'm not sure if at the end you wanted to loop around to explaining the actual genetic reasons why this doesn't work in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I can go through some of the genetic stuff. I mean, really, the no DNA test in Israel is a complete myth, and I see this propagated all the time through our circles. Like I wasn't able to like really trace the exact point of origin of this specific idea, like who first came up with this, but I did find some very early layers of essentially what's going on is hackers hacked data set, like data that was specifically like Jewish DNA data. I think it was on 23andMe or one of those websites, and they specifically targeted that data to get. And as like a response, a bunch of Jews in Israel freaked out and essentially tried to pass like what I would call like draconian data protection laws. But these are the same types of laws that they have in Europe on data protection. You know, you have to, if you're a European, you have to have your data stored. The person has to have their data stored in Europe and all this other stuff. It's kind of why like Ireland has become such a huge data center almost in a way. Because of this same, like these data protection laws. So people look at those laws and they reinterpret them to say there's no DNA tests. Also, there's restrictions on DNA tests that are related to their religious laws and the Mizrahi and the Hasidics and all this other stuff. They have all these like autistic laws that are restricting DNA test access in Israel, but none of those, again, are total bans or anything. And what we know for sure is that Jews aren't like hiding secret DNA and like, oh, we have to make sure we don't tell anybody that we're Jews, and they're hiding DNA tests. That's for sure not happening, and you know that because all you have to do is a couple things. First of all, you can buy a DNA test in Israel. You can literally VPN as someone from Israel, go to 23andMe and purchase and say ship to my house in Israel, okay? And that will go through. That's totally fine. If you want an easier option, you can just go to social media. From the location, you can do a location-based social media and just type in DNA results or 23andMe, and you will see authentic people posting from Israel their DNA tests. The entire conspiracy or concept that we aren't DNA testing Jews in Israel is insane. And the fact that Tucker even brought this up shows how this idea is going to become a problem in our thing, right? I predicted this like a couple months ago, like maybe 6 months ago, I was saying that this was going to be a big issue because I saw Tucker and Candace flirting with it. And the big thing here is it's so easily disproven, right? It's so easily disproven, but also I can't really name like a group of people other than Jews who are like more obsessed with genetic research and DNA research, and they I don't know this for sure, but if I had to guess, they're probably per capita the most genetically tested people on the planet because they have so many genetic disorders, and they have all these things that, all these genetic disorders and all these other things going on, and a lot of them are like wealthier so they can afford it, and all these other things, all these other reasons. We have so much DNA for Jews. Like, this is crazy. And they keep doing meta studies and all these other different studies and analyzing ancient Bronze Age bodies and comparing that DNA to modern DNA. And I would never say like, oh, they're the exact same 100% people that are from the Old Testament, from the temple destruction, and genetically the same. That's obviously not what anyone's saying. But no group has retained 100%, and they are a group that is 50% or 40 to 60% depending on the person, and it's admixture that they got after 2,000 years basically in diaspora conditions. That doesn't negate their identity. Okay, it doesn't negate their identity, I would say, for the purposes that we're talking about, as I guess the better way to put that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's cultural content. Oh, sorry, but I was just saying, and there's cultural continuity there too, and like, again, the admixture, it's not like part Near Eastern, part Caucasus for European Jews. It's like European Jews are Near Eastern plus European. North African Jews are Near Eastern plus North African, and so on and so forth. Yeah, but no, this conspiracy theory in particular, the no DNA tests in Israel, really stood out to me because I've seen it in other contexts where it's not about Hazar theory, but it's about like someone trying to stop DNA tests because they've got reptilian whatever DNA. And that's a real overlap of conspiracy theorism with this.
Well, hold on. The reason that specific one, okay, I found the video for this. It's going to be in my piece. I found the video for this. I found the source for this. It's literally a prank channel video trying to it's like one of the YouTube prank channel videos that was released at the time, like, I don't know, a couple of years ago, or I guess 10 years or more ago. That's what that is. And what they're doing is they're taking a cotton swab and swabbing the lizard's mouth and then putting it in and saying, look, it came back Ashkenazi. Ha ha ha. And I'm telling you, that is the source of this, of people believing that, right? So now think about this. You are interacting with somebody online who didn't even do like the most basic level like thinking, okay? Because the DNA test that they use in the video, it's obviously not. I mean, that's not how you take a DNA test. You don't just put a cotton swab in your cheeks and then throw it in. That's not how it works. It's similar to that, but not exactly. And that is what that type of person is falling for. Is like very obviously retarded prank videos being repurposed to say that, oh, look, Jews are lizard people. That's where that comes from. It's a prank video. So whoever, whenever you see those things, just know that's the level of baseness we're dealing with. That's the level of research that was done into it. These people didn't absorb these ideas because they read them and reasoned their way to them. These new guys, these new people, they've gotten to this point because of vibes, right? They've vibed their way to this thing. So we now have to sculpt those vibes to be useful, because right now it's just like a flat blobby mush.
I just yes. I was going to add, with the DNA testing thing, it's funny. We literally have now, through the Epstein files, as if you needed more proof, people saying we should DNA test to see if they're Jewish. Like, clearly, Jews are not opposed to doing DNA tests. It is kind of an absurd myth to say that like they refuse to engage in that. And to your point about the prank channels, first of all, it's funny. I was talking to Doug about prank channels recently off the podcast as sort of a nostalgic thing that I remember when I was younger, because I've seen the resurgence of one of them, Connor Murphy, on Twitter. That's a whole aside. But it's like, yeah, if you have a guy who's got just blatantly incorrect information, like, you can just easily correct this. Like, you're not. I've always used the analogy before, right? I like heavy metal, and there's people that will argue that, not as much nowadays, but during the 80s, right, there was the satanic panic, and there were people saying that if you listen to metal, you're going to, next thing you know, you're going to be sacrificing children to Baphomet or whatever, right? This is not the case. As it turns out, in my research on the Order of Nine Angles, it really seems to come more from playing Roblox. But that's a joke. Obviously, Roblox is not going to make you a Satanist. But I've always thought the idea that like a single song could change your entire religious worldview it tells me that you must not have believed very strongly in that religion in the first place, or I guess you must not have had much resistance to doing human sacrifice if you think that one song could tip you over the edge, right? And it's kind of like this with the JQ stuff, where if somebody's entire like worldview hinges on the idea that Jews are secretly reptiles, or that they're Khazars, or that they're Polish, or whatever, then they're saying that they wouldn't have a problem with any of this otherwise, right? And I don't think, like, honestly, if you're dealing with somebody who's new to the JQ and they believe in the Khazar stuff, I don't think it's going to be that difficult to get them to stick around without the Khazar thing. Because I don't know many people who got JQ'd specifically because they read about that issue. The problem is, see, people see what is objectively true, right? Epstein, October 7th, the Iran stuff, the treatment of Gaza, etc. And then when they look for an explanation to go deeper, when they get interested in this topic, they are finding people that are giving them misinformation, right? So most of these people, they're not just going to forget about Gaza if you tell them that, Jews are not actually reptiles. They're not going to suddenly go, oh, well, I guess the Gaza genocide is justified. Right? They're not going to say, oh, well, I guess raping kids is cool because this guy's ethnically, Near Eastern and, not from the Caucasus or the steppes, right? This is not going to happen. So you shouldn't, right? You shouldn't be scared to tell these people this. You're not destroying you're not destroying the moment we're in right now, right? All you're doing is leading them to somewhere that's actually going to be more firm, more rigid, and something that they will actually believe in more strongly. You're actually only helping the cause by educating these people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and there's a ton of it, man. Like I deal with a certain type of people in my replies because of the topics that I cover. I get a little autistic about the Abrahamic religions, and so I get it, and I argue with these people. I get it, like. So I might have like a biased view towards who's like in my replies or anything like that. But I'm telling you guys, like, we all have this concept right now that, oh, everyone's waking up, everything's going great. But guys, I'm telling you, like, most of it is stuff it's people who believe in this kind of thing right here. And like, this is not a firm belief like you described. And it's not something that we can like do a whole lot with. Right. So we have to understand what we're actually like. We have to understand our actual position on the chessboard. Like I said earlier, we have to understand like where the pieces are. And, I think that this kind of great awakening, or however you want to describe it, I think it's great. I think it's a good thing, but it's going to be kind of squandered if we spend all day kind of like throwing tomatoes at each other and pissed about this or pissed about that, or someone's take on this and that. Like, we basically all need to kind of just put these, in my view anyway, these like petty differences aside, and we need to focus through whatever lens you guys might have. Like, look, I don't, I think we talked about this earlier. I don't necessarily agree with you on Russia, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go and do your version of education, and then I can, oh, look, he's teaching people about Prester John or whatever you want to debunk, right? And or Khazar theory, whatever you're doing. Like, there's no reason why we can't all live in the same ecosystem here. Does that make sense? Like, that's always been my view. People misunderstand my point of view on that stuff, and I get attacked. Oh, you're an HT guy, or you're a TRS guy. It happens all the time. Oh, you're a Groiper. I get called a Groiper. It's hilarious. Or I'm one of Spencer. Like, all these things happen. And I think it's more important that we start seeing ourselves in this way, because we have basically a very low amount of people that are going to be able to do this, or that can do, or that do this. The number of people who are like smart enough to do research, figure out like, okay, this isn't true, that is true. How do we combat this type of thing that people are thinking? Because this kind of stuff, like I said, is everywhere in this movement right now. I would almost say that it's like the core same people that we had like 10 years ago. Like, it's the number that has grown since then of like authentic, like, or solid people is way, 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 way less than we think, because so many of them believe in this nonsense, or some version of this nonsense. And it's funny, while we're doing this podcast right now, you said, oh, it's a Protestant problem. I right now have a Catholic in my replies doing the exact theology I just laid out, right? So this is
Yep.
constant for me all day long. It's happening right now, all the time, constantly, and it's not just a Protestant, right? This is a Catholic doing it, and this Catholic does not go to church. They do not read the Bible, and the Catholic Church itself, as an institution, if it finds this person, it finds their account, or this person was to ever do like any sort of political movement or political action as a Catholic, it would be the institution would turn on and try to crush this person. Okay, so this is very unhelpful, and it's not just one group of people or that group of people. It's across the board. Like all different types of people basically are believing in some version of this theory. This guy's telling me Christianity is Jacob, Jews are Esau, Edom, blah blah blah. Like this is the whole thing, guys. This is so many people believe this. Jews do not worship Yahweh, dummy, he says, because Jesus is Yahweh incarnate. Okay, do you guys understand that Jews are not worshiping the devil? They're not worshiping Baal. They are worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And to say anything
And they
else
think this
is a
guy's
lie.
Edom.
Yes, they're literally trying to do know you back to Jews. Essentially, that's what this is. This is the like low peasant IQ version of know you. So, like I said, I think I've made the case pretty well. This is why I think that this type of bullshit, like we need to combat this, or we're gonna miss this chance that we have right now.
Yeah, although there's one argument that I don't think you've considered. So I've been reading some Greek newspapers lately, including one about Benjamin Netanyahu, an article, and it referred to him as Judaicos. So I think you don't understand this quite right. Benjamin Netanyahu's not Jewish, he's Judean.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, dude, I get so many of these things like this. I mean, you see it, right? You pay attention to this stuff, and like, I don't know, guys. A lot of people think like, oh, I don't know how you deal with it. This is so crazy. None of these things are hard to debunk or just go through. Like, I don't like. Obviously, there's just going to be stupid people out there, but I don't know. None of these things are difficult. They're not Jewish. They're Judean thing is crazy.
I guess I'll wrap this up a bit if you guys are cool, and say kind of as a final point. You said something there that I really, really, really agree with, and something that I've kind of tried to explain to people, which is, yeah, at this moment, absolutely, there is some kind of utility in those of us who disagree on things arguing about our disagreements. But it's clear that, like, broadly speaking, we need to be some type of united front. One could say we need to unite the right, but more seriously, right, like, if we really want this to not be a fad, yeah, we need to realize, and I always tell people this, right? You're going to have, Christians, you're going to have pagans, you're going to have people that are into different strains of politics, people coming from a more left-wing background, people that are coming from a more right-wing background. And, what we have to do is, if we can unite around, at the moment, a correct interpretation of the Jewish question, we will be in such a stronger position. And then, we can start to worry about all this other stuff. How about we get some victories on the board, right? To use the chess analogy, let's take a couple of their pieces. Let's make a few advances before we start fighting among ourselves, just nonstop and derailing things. Because what often I think tends to happen, unfortunately, is people get into these kind of internecine conflicts, and that becomes their thing. Like right now, I've been really, really, really hammering on the Iran stuff, because I want it to be clear to everyone that, if you are genuinely, you say you're JQ'd or whatever, you can't be supporting a war with Iran, on behalf of Israel. And that, I think that's something that right now is useful. I do not think that it's useful for people to engage in these like weird, like beefs about something minor. If somebody says something incorrect, correct them by all means. And don't get me wrong, it's fun to argue with people on the internet. Like, I fully get the appeal. I do it probably more than I should. But it's like, yeah, at this moment, you do have to kind of accept on some level. There are guys that are going to have a somewhat different approach. As long as their tactic and their grounding on the important questions is the same, you're just going to have to accept that there's going to be some minor disagreements on the side. And if you don't, you're never going to get anywhere. And we saw what happened when people really, really started to purity spiral and bicker about little things in the past. It's never ended up somewhere productive. All the most successful political movements that we would say we agree with have figured out this before and have operated as, as political parties, for example, that had people with different, religious views, different opinions on the economy, different this, different that, but they were united around a couple of basic key points. And I think that we need to do that going forward if we want to, like you said, actually take advantage of this moment and use it to propagate our ideas.
Cool. Yeah, I'm right there with you guys. Like I said, a lot of people just don't understand. Like I don't like fully represent Adam or anything. He's my friend, but a lot of people misunderstand where me and Adam are coming from. We like presuppose all of the ideas that each other have on, or that you guys have on the Jewish question. The way we view this is not that we're attacking Christians for the sake of Christianity. The way we see this is we are looking at this through the Abrahamic lens as a whole, okay? And it's an addition to all the stuff that you guys presuppose. So I understand why people might not like that. I get it. But like there has to be somebody in this lane doing this, or we're just going to be totally blind to like one of the most core, most inner parts of Judaism, which is the religious angle, right? And how that Abrahamic matrix, how it functions in our politics. So yeah, I'm right there with you. That's kind of where I'm going to be at. We're going to be educating and doing things. I said this the other night in the space that we were in. It's been 10 years or however long it's been since Europa, and people are like, they release mixes and things like that. With the way AI tools are and videos are, like the way video creation and content creation works these days, there's no excuse for people to not take whatever their free time is or whatever their hobby time is and start working on projects and things like this themselves. It is very easy for you to kind of like lock yourself in and just do like something like that. And these things have massive ripple effects that, are immeasurable. Just imagine if there was no Europa, for example, or there was no, and there's issues there, but let's not focus on that. These types of, this type of content, it hasn't, like the spark isn't there, guys. Like we need to reignite that spark, this artistic, this creative spark that we've had in 2016, and we need to bring it back and start taking advantage of like this new technological situation we have where basically anybody can create this stuff. So that's what I would say. So you guys should make a movie or like a short film on, your issue or your issue, your lens of the JQ. Adam and I, we're working on ours, things like that. And that's kind of what we need to do together as this group of people is educate and level up all of these people who have now, there's just so many of them that are, there's so many to choose from that we're going to have to do a lot of leveling up. It's going to take a lot of experience, I guess, to farm.
Yeah, although because you brought up your stuff with Adam Green, I do have to ask, considering today's new war, which has started, do you guys have any Book of Esther stuff, or either you or Mr. Green, that's perhaps relevant to today's Purim, or tomorrow's Purim, but today's events?
Yeah, look, this is, Adam and I have been talking about this subject now for so long. I don't know if we have anything that I've written or anything. Maybe I just kind of started doing this writing such thing where I'm going to start getting a lot of my ideas out there, especially once the Khazar piece is done. I'm just going to start cranking out like way shorter pieces that are just on this type of thing. Book of Esther, boom, there's that. Lamentations. I have so much to say about Lamentations that I think a lot of people that do Holocaust deconstruction will see what I'm talking about in the Book of Lamentations and instantly pick up on it and see what I mean. So I got to do that kind of thing. But as far as like what's going on now in its relation to the broader Abrahamic deconstruction stuff that we do, to me, this is like very unsurprising. It is. They're framing it as Book of Esther stuff, right? Like Amalekites and all these other things, like on the news, on CNN, they're using these terms. They're using these biblical terms because they're in our shared lexicon with them because we share this holy book. So what ends up happening is our leaders and everybody are just totally bought into this story, and they all think that like, oh, it's totally like Jesus coming back time. And like a lot of our leaders and a lot of our elites think this now. Even the secular ones are like, oh, maybe there is something to it. Like that's kind of how prophecy deception functions, right? And yeah, the date and all that stuff, the date of it being today, I so badly wish I tweeted it because Adam and I and Big Tech had done the same thing where we had predicted because of this day and how that lines up with the story of Purim and all these, the Book of Esther and all that other stuff. How those things kind of interact with politics is so important in my view, because even if Judaism is largely secular, or Jews are largely secular, kind of thing, right? That's obviously going on, but the religious core still is dictating a large amount of power, and we see that when we see things like this, when it's, oh look, it's on the specific astrological meme day at the same time as our holy Purim and all these things. Like, it's not just an accident. And like, look, like Kushner, Lutnick, these people, look, they don't. If you think that they don't know what I'm talking about, like, I don't know what to tell you. They absolutely do, and they talk about it. They talk about these things in those terms, in these biblical terms, in this biblical lexicon. That's how they all view this. So even if you think that how we're going about this might be wrong, having an understanding of how this system operates with the religion, with the Abrahamic system that it's operating under, is just so important to understand what's going on, even in the political world.
Yep. So I guess in conclusion, we want Moshiach now. We don't want to wait.
Well, the other version of that, did you see? Did you see what they're all tweeting today? All the Zionist Christians are tweeting. They're tweeting Christ is King today. That's the battle cry. That's the war cry of Iran. The war cry to go to war with Iran is Christ is King. That's basically we want Moshiach now. It's basically.
Yep.
So that's where we're at, right? So, like I said, I get it. I get why people don't like talking about this stuff. It's rough, but it's the reality of the situation. So
putting up with Esau, down with Ishmael on your banner.
Yeah, exactly.